First thing Mara Voss ever decoded was her father's handwriting. She was 9. He'd left a note on the kitchen counter before one of his long absences. Another dig, another grant, another month of satellite calls that cut out mid-sentence, and the note was in his cramped academic shorthand, half Greek, half English. The letters pinched like he was always in a hurry, like the world was running out of time to receive his thoughts. Mother had laughed and said she couldn't read it either. Mara had sat at the table for 40 minutes, with a pencil and a scrap of notepaper, translating symbol by symbol, and when she was done it said, "Back by the 14th. There's money in the blue jar." "Tell Mara," I said, "the stars are still counting." She didn't know what that meant. She kept the note anyway. Now she was 17, sitting in the back of a military transport that smelled of hydraulic fluid and cold metal. And her father was across the aisle from her, and they hadn't spoken in 6 minutes. She was counting. The hegemony officer escorting them kept stealing glances at her tablet, as if a teenager's notes could be more classified than the coordinates they were flying toward. Mara let him look. She'd encrypted the important parts. Her name was Dr. K.L. Voss, technically. On the tablet she still called him Dad, in the private folders. In the shorthand she developed herself at 13, when she realized his attention moved like a searchlight. Bright and warm when it landed on you, then swinging away. She'd learned to leave markers, breadcrumbs, things interesting enough to catch the beam. "Sector 7 is going to be cold," said the officer. His name was Reyes. He was 40-something, jaw like a bunker door, the kind of man who introduced himself by rank before name. "You'll want to lay her up." "I know," said Kale. He was looking out the scratched porthole at the gray nothing below. Threshold territories from above looked like a bruise. Vast flat plains of scorched regolith where the Ankanu had first set down their anchor. Columns 52 years ago, before the Accords, before anyone understood what anchor columns were or what they were anchoring.
"I've been to Sector 7.
3 times, Mara said. She hadn't looked up from her tablet. Reyes blinked. "Expedition are partially declassified." She pulled up a page without ceremony. 2041, 2047, 2051. Same sector, different quadrant. He was trying to triangulate the resonance pattern before the hegemony told him to stop. Kale looked at her then. Something moved across his face. Not quite pride, not quite guilt. Something in between that didn't have a clean name. "She's good," he said to Reyes, as if Marfa weren't sitting 4 feet away. "I know," she said again. "You used to say that to Mom too. Person like I wasn't there." The officer looked at the floor. Kale looked back out the porthole. 6 minutes and 45 seconds. A new record. Dr. Senefi Banez was waiting for them at the field station, standing in the wind with her arms crossed, and her jacket unzipped because she never got cold. She'd told Mara this over comm 3 weeks ago, when she'd asked if Mara wanted to come. "I don't get cold, and I don't get scared, and I've been inside one of their structures before and come out. Which puts me in a very small club. So, yes, I'd like your eyes on this, because you cracked the tertiary cipher when 4 of my people couldn't." She hadn't asked Kale. Kale had found through channels, had called Mara's mother, had shown up at the transport dock at 0500 with a bag and a look that said, "I'm coming, and we can talk about it later." They hadn't talked about it yet. Senna shook hands with Reyes, nodded at Kale. They knew each other from conferences, professional courtesy that looked like it had survived at least one professional disagreement. And then she looked at Mara and smiled like she actually meant it. "You're taller than your photo," Senna said. "You're shorter," Mara said. Senna laughed. "Good. I hate it when people are polite. Come on. It's active and I want your brain in front of it before another 9 hours pass." The anchor column in Sector 7 was a pillar of Ankanu stone about 40 meters high and 12 across, surfaced in a material that the Hegemony's materials lab had been trying to categorize for 30 years and consistently failed to. It wasn't metal. It wasn't ceramic. Under spectrographic analysis, it returned readings that looked like arithmetic errors. The stone, if you called it stone, was the color of old blood where the sun hit it, and the color of deep water where it didn't. And it hummed at a frequency you felt in your molars before you heard it with your ears. This one was different. Mara had seen the images before they flew out. The satellite captures, and the ground team footage. But images didn't prepare you. The column had cracked. Not broken, cracked like an egg. A vertical seam ran from the base to about 20 meters up, and from the seam came a light that wasn't any color Mara had a word for. It pulsed at irregular intervals. The ground around the base was scorched in a pattern she recognized. "That's a glyph," she said. "Yes," said Senna. "The Eastern orientation. The one they use for..." Mara was already pulling up her tablet, fingers moving fast. "For passage. Or threshold." I argued with Dr. Patton about this for 2 weeks. He said it meant Chelan boundary. And I said that was a mistranslation of the root form, and she stopped, looked at the column. Something came out. "Yes," said Senna. "What?" Senna was quiet for a moment. Around them, the field station crew moved with a particular efficiency of people who had learned to look busy so they didn't have to look scared. "We don't have a designation yet," she said. "The sensor package calls it a Class 9 manifestation. Big. Asymmetrical. The ground team that was here when it happened." She stopped. "There were 6 of them. We recovered 3. The briefing room some was a tent with a heater and a folding table, and a screen that kept flickering." Race stood by the door with his arms crossed. Kale sat beside Mara, which was new. He usually sat at the head of anything he was in, a habit she'd noticed so long ago it felt like a natural law, and she thought maybe he was rattled, or maybe he was doing the thing where he stayed close to her, because he didn't know how to say, "I'm glad you're here." She didn't say anything about it. The footage was hard to watch. Not because it was graphic. The sensor package wasn't designed for high-resolution, visual, but because of the scale. The thing on the screen was enormous. It moved in a way that made the footage look corrupted. Each frame slightly wrong, like the recording equipment couldn't fully commit to what it was seeing. It had a form, bilateral symmetry, 4 limbs, a mass consistent with maybe 400 tons. But it also had a quality that made form feel like the wrong word, like calling the ocean a quantity of water. "The Onkenos texts call it a keeper," Kale said. He'd said almost nothing since the transport, and now he said this quietly, like he was thinking out loud. "Not a guardian, a keeper. There's a distinction in the root language. A guardian protects, a keeper maintains. It maintains something." "The column," said Senna. "The anchor column system. We've known for a decade that the columns aren't just structures. They're nodes in a network. If one goes dormant, the others destabilize. If one breaks, the keeper comes to fix it," Mara said, "or to punish whatever broke it." Reyes from the door. "The texts don't support that framing," Kale said. He looked at Reyes and said it without apology, the way academics do. The Ankenu weren't a punitive culture. Their cosmology was about balance, systems. "A keeper isn't angry. It killed 3 people," said Reyes. Silence. "They got between it and the column," Kale said finally. "Quitter." "Distinction without a difference," said Reyes. Mara looked at the frozen frame on the screen. The keeper at the edge of the sensor range, its outline bleeding into the sky. She thought about the glyph on the ground. She thought about the note her father had left when she was 9. "The stars are still counting." "There's a sequence in the tertiary layer of the anchor column inscription," she said. "Not the orientation glyph. Below it. I saw it in the ground team footage at timestamp 417. She pulled it up on her tablet. 7 symbols in a cluster. The Anknu used clusters of 7 for the great nodes," Kale said. He was looking at her tablet now. His voice had changed completely. "The wonders. For the convergence sites. The network isn't just this column," Mara said. "There are 7 primary nodes. And if this one cracked, the others are failing," said Senna. She said it like she'd already known and had been waiting for someone else to say it first. They called it the Convergence Protocol in the hastily assembled hegemony paperwork, which was the kind of name that made Mara want to put her head on the table. She didn't. She spent the next 16 hours cross-referencing the tertiary cipher against every Anka-Next fragment in the open database, and 3 that Senna clearance to access, and 2 that she theoretically didn't, but Senna handed her the access code without comment. The short version: there were 7 anchor column at 7 sites, each corresponding to an inscription sim cluster the Ankanu had embedded in what humans had built above them over the following centuries, or hadn't built, but stood at the edge of, or worshipped over, or simply felt, and called sacred without knowing why. 7 sites, 7 locks, and the keeper moved between them on a circuit that the Ankanu called, roughly translated, the counting. The counting had a purpose. At each site, the keeper reaffirmed the column, some quantity of itself into the lock, and the network stayed stable. If the circuit was broken, if someone cracked a column open, say, because they were drilling through regolith for geothermal surveys, and hadn't read the right classification files, the keeper became uncoupled. It didn't patrol its circuit. It wandered, and the columns, without the circuit to maintain them, began to destabilize. What happened when 7 anchor columns destabilized simultaneously? The texts described with an unusual degree of precision for a civilization not known for catastrophizing. Mara read the passage 3 times to make sure she had the translation right. She did. She went and found Senna. "The columns are gravitational anchors," she said, without preamble, because she had learned from watching Senna that preamble was social grooming. People who weren't sure their information was good enough to stand on its own. The Ankanu arrived in a ship, or something like a ship. We've always assumed they were visitors, but the texts say settlers. They anchored their arrival point to the planet's gravitational field through 7 fixed columns. And those columns have been running ever since, keeping something in place. If they all fail. Senna looked at her with an expression Mara had never quite seen on an adult before. It was something like respect and something like, "Oh, we're both scared." "Their ship," Senna said. "Still here somewhere deep, and if the columns fail it," Mara checked her notes. "The word is rises." That's the closest translation. It rises. The keeper was not malevolent. This was the thing Mara kept coming back to in the hours that followed, while Reyes mobilized 2 hegemony strike teams and Senna argued with command over comm, and Kale sat at the folding table and wrote in his paper notebook like he'd been doing since she was a child. Longhand, quick, cramped letters, thinking out loud on the page. Not malevolent, not angry. It wasn't trying to destroy anything. It was trying to fix something. And it didn't have a frame of reference for why the small biological things kept getting in the way of the fixing. To the keeper, a human being in front of the column was the same as a rock in front of the column. An obstacle. Removal required. This made it worse, somehow, and better in one specific way. It meant it could be redirected. The text described the circuit, the sequence of sites. The keeper moved in a specific order. Not arbitrary, not random. Each site building on the last in a pattern that followed the Ankinu's own orbital. Mathematics. If you could get ahead of it, if you could be at each site before it arrived and complete whatever the site required, whatever the column needed, you could restore the circuit yourself. Lead the keeper back onto the path, give it the confirmation it was looking for. 7 sites, 7 puzzles. The word the text used wasn't quite riddle, but it was close. A thing that could only be answered by understanding what it was. Fort 4. Can't get to 7 sites in. Reyes stopped. He'd been going to say, in time. And then he'd looked at a map and done math and stopped. The circuit runs roughly west to east along the old Ankanu arrival trajectory, Kale said. He'd put down the notebook. He was reading over Mara's shoulder, which he used to do when she was little, before he started treating her work the way you treat a colleague's, respectfully distant. The original sites correspond to geological formations that were already there. Humans built over them later. Petra, Gobekli Tepe, the Giza Plateau, Tikal. 2 others in areas that went underwater in the subsidence events, and one that the texts place at. He traced a finger on the screen. Here, inside the threshold zone, where we are. Here is already broken, said Mara. Here is the starting point, he said. Means the circuit goes 7 sites and comes back. The keeper runs the circuit, and when it arrives back at the start, checks the origin column. If the origin is stable, the circuit closes. If not, it runs it again, said Mara, looking for the break, indefinitely. He was quiet then. It's been running the circuit for 52 years, looking for the break, looking for why it can't close. The weight of that sat on the tent for a moment. Because we cracked the column, said Reyes. No, said Mara. The geothermal drilling cracked the column. The keeper was already decoupled. The drilling was... Why? She stopped. Rechecked. Her heart did something complicated. The drilling cracked the column, yes. The keeper decoupled. Her. The drilling, 52 years ago. She pulled up the archive. The first anchor column anomaly was recorded in 2024, 14 years before first contact. Something happened to the circuit in 2024, and we didn't know what it was because we didn't know the circuit existed. Silence. We broke it, said Kale, very quietly. Some of us, said Mara. Reyes looked between them. What does that mean? It means the Ankenu settled here and built a system that maintained their arrival point, and humans built over the sites. Sometime in 2024, something a human did, a survey, a dig, a drilling operation we haven't identified yet, disrupted the circuit, and the keeper has been trying to fix it ever since, while we've been treating it like an attack. She heard herself say it and felt the word land somewhere strange and solid. It's not an attack. It's a repair crew. Reyes looked at her for a long moment. Okay, he said, and she thought this was why he'd survived as long as he had. He didn't spend time on ego when the situation required otherwise. So we go to the sites. What do we do at each one? Texts describe confirmation sequences, Kale said. He looked at Mara. You've translated them? Most of them. She pulled up her tablet. They're not simple. They involve the 4 primary elements the Ankenu categorized, not the classical Greek 4, their version. Mass, wave, bond, and void. Each site tests one element of the circuit, confirms that that anchor point is still coherent. You have to demonstrate understanding. You have to. She thought about it. You have to answer correctly. Riddles, said Kale. He almost smiled. The oldest form of a lock, riddles, she agreed. The first site was 200 kilometers south, at a rock formation that the Ankenu had anchored to the local granite shelf. Column here wasn't visible. It ran underground, beneath a mesa that a local indigenous land trust had been trying to get federal protection for since the 90s for reasons they described as, the land doesn't want to be cut. Mara made a note that somebody owed them an enormous apology. The anchor point manifested as a chamber below the mesa, accessible through a crack in the rock face that the ground team had to widen with careful charges. Inside, the air tasted like static. The walls were covered in Ankenu script, and at the center of the chamber was a plinth of the same knotstone as the columns, and on the plinth was a pattern. Mass, said Mara. She studied the pattern. It was 3-dimensional. The knotstone shifted as you looked at it, the pattern rotating in a way that suggested more dimensions than 3, or possibly exactly 3, but arranged differently. This one is about mass, about what holds things to other things. She thought about gravity, about the columns, about why a civilization crossing the void between stars would need to anchor itself to a planet's field, rather than just landing. Because landing was temporary, anchoring was staying. It wants to know that you understand weight, that you understand what it means to be bound. She put her hand on the plinth. It was warm. Mara, said Kale. I know, she said. She was already working. The pattern responded to touch, not randomly, not like a screen, but like a conversation. It asked, and you answered with pressure and position, and something she couldn't name, some quality of attention. Father had always said she paid attention differently than other people. Not better, just differently, at angles, reading the thing next to the thing instead of the thing itself. She answered the pattern. It took 11 minutes. When she finished, the knotstone emitted a sound like a very large, very distant bell, and something below them shifted. 1, she said. She was sweating. Hands were shaking slightly. She didn't mention it. Reyes was watching her, with an expression she was starting to read as his version of rest. 6, she said. They moved fast. Senna coordinated transport, military aircraft, civilian charter, twice a ground convoy through territory that required diplomatic clearance that Reyes produced from some sub-pocket of hegemony authority she hadn't known existed. Kale navigated. He'd been to most of the sites before, had stood at the edges of the sacred without knowing what he was standing at, and he moved now with a kind of focus that Mara recognized because she saw it in the mirror. The focus of someone who'd been building toward something their whole life without knowing what it was. She started to understand, somewhere over the Mediterranean, why he'd kept going back. Not ego, not career. The columns called a certain kind of mind. She felt it now, the low frequency, the hum in the back teeth. He'd been feeling it for decades and following it because it was the only answer he had to a question he couldn't quite articulate. She also understood, though she didn't say it, that she felt it too. She didn't say it yet. The second sight was wave. Sound and light and resonance. The way vibration moved through the structure of things. The chamber was inside a limestone formation that had been a pilgrimage site for at least 9,000 years and now was managed by a heritage trust and closed to the public. The pattern here moved, genuinely moved, oscillating in standing waves that had to be read and matched and countered. Mara sat on the floor and watched it for 20 minutes before she understood the logic. Kale sat beside her. Not too close, just present. Through it, he said. I don't need to talk through it. I know, he said. But sometimes I understand things better when I hear them out loud. She looked at him sideways. That's the most honest thing you've said to me in about 3 years, she said. He didn't have an answer for that. She was already back at the pattern. She solved it in 43 minutes. The bell sound resonated through the stone, lower this time, as if the first and second confirmations were starting to build a chord. 2, she said. The keeper found them at the third site. It came up through the ground. They felt it before they saw it, a subsonic tremor, a change in air pressure, and then it was simply fear, there. In the way that large things sometimes were too big for the eye to process quickly, the mind instead receiving it in pieces. One limb, a shoulder, a face that wasn't quite a face, that was organized around the concept of a face the way a translation is organized around an original text, capturing the meaning, slightly different in the texture. Reyes's teams opened fire. They were hegemony standard equipped, which meant the rifles they carried were designed for the kind of engagement the Ankanu had required in the early Accord Wars. High-yield, penetrating rounds that could put holes in materials that laughed at conventional munitions. They were effective the way a fly is effective against a window. Stop, said Mara. She said it at a normal volume. Because she had found that people listened to a normal volume in a crisis more than they listened to a shout. She didn't know why this was true, but it was reliably true. Reyes held up a fist. The firing stopped. The keeper was not looking at the soldiers. It was looking at the chamber entrance. It was looking at the plinth. It's checking, Mara said. It came to this site to check the column. Already here. It doesn't know what to do with that. She took a breath. Let me go in. Absolutely not, said Kale. I'm going in, she said. If it kills me, it kills me. But I don't think it will because I don't think it kills things it doesn't perceive as obstacles. And if I'm actively confirming the column, I'm not an obstacle. She searched for the word. I'm participating in the same function, part of the repair. Kale looked at her. She looked back. I'm going in, she said, gentler. This time, he let her. She walked to the chamber entrance. The keeper was 6 meters away, which was close enough that she could see the surface of it. The way its exterior moved, a slow roil like clouds forming, like something that had never needed a fixed edge because the concept of a fixed edge was a biological concern, and it was not biological. It was not anything with a clean category. She didn't run. She walked steadily, not performing calm, just inhabiting it, because she had her father's note memorized, and she was thinking about it. The stars are still counting. She'd never figured out what it meant, and now she thought maybe she had. The Ankanu had built a counting system. 7 sites, a circuit, keeper counting and recounting, looking for the break. The stars were still counting, because the universe required maintenance and maintenance, required someone who showed up. She put her hands on the plinth. Bond, the third element, the forces that held matter together at the near scale, the invisible obligations of atoms. The patterns here were dense, stacked, incredibly fine, the most complex she'd encountered. And she sat with them for a long time, feeling the keeper's presence at the doorway, pressure in the air, not menacing, not patient either, just Trude keep it. The way a fact is present. Her hands shook. She steadied them. She thought about bonds, about the chemical variety and the other kind, about her father's cramped handwriting, about the fact that he was standing somewhere behind her right now and hadn't left. She solved it. The bell sound came, and this time it was joined by the previous two, a chord of three, harmonic in a tuning system she didn't have a name for. The keeper made a sound in response. Not language, not exactly, but something with structure, something with intent. She turned to look at it. It was looking at her, not at the plinth. At her. "We're fixing it," she said, out loud. She knew it couldn't understand her. Their xenolinguistics teams had made essentially no progress on Ankanu verbal communication in 50 years. She said it anyway because it felt like the right register. Acknowledgement. Respect. "We see what you're doing, and we're doing the same thing. We'll finish. Give us time." The keeper held for a moment that lasted longer than she could count. Then it moved. Not toward her, sideways. And then into the ground the way it had come, returning to its circuit. Reyes breathed out so hard it sounded like a structural failure. "3," said Mara. She came back out into the light. Her legs were steady. She was surprised. 4 more. 4th and 5th sites she solved in sequence over 36 hours with almost no sleep. Running on the field rations, Senna kept pressing into her hands. And the particular focused energy of someone who had found the thing they were built. Void, the quality of space, of distance, of the necessary emptiness that allowed structure, and then a 5th element she hadn't anticipated. The texts called roughly memory, which she thought was closer to keep, record, to the way a system held the knowledge of its own function over time. Memory. She understood memory. At the 5th site, Hale sat beside her for 4 hours while she worked, not talking, not helping, just there. At some point, he passed her a flask of coffee from the pack he'd been carrying since Sector 7, the same battered gray thermos she remembered from childhood, from the time she'd been allowed to go with him, the time she'd sat in the dust of a real dig and felt the presence of old things. She drank it without comment. "I should have taken you more," he said finally. "When you were young. To the sites I was." He stopped, restarted. I thought I was protecting you from the uncertainty of it. The funding falling through, the wrong call on a translation, the years of work that led nowhere. The Solar's life was too much too." He stopped again. "Inflict," she said. "I was going to say. Offer. Inflict is probably more honest." She kept her eyes on the pattern. "I found the sites anyway." "I know," he said. "Through me, through my notes. You were reading my work before you were reading your coursework. Your work was more interesting." "I know that too." He was quiet. "I'm not very good at being a person who is also a father. I'm very good at the work, and I thought those were related." "They're not," she said. "I know," he said. She solved the 5th lock. The chord of confirmations deepened. 5 tones now, building towards something she felt in her sternum. 2 more, she said. And then, "You can come with me. Into the 6th one. I might need to talk it through." He was quiet for long enough that she thought she'd misjudged. Then, "Okay." The keeper found them again at the 6th site, which was the coastal formation on the eastern edge of the first Ankenu arrival zone, where the original survey teams had found the first artifacts and the first texts, and had photographed everything, and understood nothing. The keeper was not alone this time. The network's destabilization had progressed. 3 secondary manifestations, smaller, denser, faster, moved in the keeper's periphery, drawn to the failing columns the way current was drawn to a fault in a circuit. They weren't keepers. The text called them maintenance nodes, which was an unglamorous designation for something that moved at 60 kilometers an hour and had already taken out a hegemony sensor array and most field vehicle. Reyes held his teams back and let Mara and Kale go in. They worked the 6th lock together, wave and mass combined, deepest integration she'd encountered. Kale caught things she missed, and she caught things he missed, and at a certain point the conversation they were having wasn't words. It was just attention directed at the same problem. And she thought maybe this was what he'd been trying to describe earlier. The way he understood things when he heard them out loud. He needed the echo. She needed the angle. two people together seeing more than either saw alone. She thought about that for a moment. Her, with her hands on the salsing knot stone, surrounded by an alien mathematics that was also, she'd come to understand, an act of love. The Ankanu had built this to stay, to anchor themselves not just physically but cosmologically, to say, we are here and we intend to remain. She thought about it, and felt something shift in her chest that wasn't the lock's confirmation. The sixth bell tone joined the chord. Outside, the secondary nodes had gone still, drawn to the confirmation. Listening. One more, said Kale. He was looking at her. His expression had been reconfiguring itself over the last 2 days into something she recognized slowly. The way you recognize a word in a foreign language once you've learned the grammar. It was the look of someone paying attention without knowing how to say they were paying attention. One more, she agreed. The seventh site was back in Sector 7, where they'd started the origin column. The crack was still there, still bleeding its color that had no name. But the glyph on the ground had changed. She saw it immediately. The orientation shifted, task symbol inverted. Return. Not an opening. A closing. The keeper was here, waiting, and it did not move as they approached. Mara stopped 5 meters from the column and looked at it. The seventh element. The texts had called it by a word that defeated her translation for 6 sites. She'd been writing it as pleek, pleesh. That wasn't right, or wasn't all of it. Standing in front of the cracked column with the keeper at her back, and the chord of 6 confirmations, humming in the stone beneath her feet, she understood it. Witness. The seventh element was witness. The acknowledgement that a system had functioned, that it had been seen, that its purpose had been recognized, that the thing it was had been understood, not by the system itself, by something outside it. The Ankenu had built this and then they'd died, or left, or become something else. The record on this was fragmentary and she had theories she hadn't had time to write up. And they'd left the system, running, tended by a keeper waiting, not for rescue, not for use, for someone to come and understand what it was for and say, I see it, I understand it, it is still good. Witness. She stepped forward and put both hands on the cracked column, and it was warm like the others, warmer or alive in a way that wasn't metaphor. She didn't solve a puzzle. There was no pattern here, no sequence, no lock. There was just the column and the crack and the color bleeding out of the break. She pressed her palms against the stone, and she said, out loud, in the open air, not caring how it sounded, I understand what this is. I understand what you built and why you built it and how long you've kept it running. I see it. It was good work. It is still good work. She felt stupid saying it. She said it anyway. The column answered, not with a bell sound, with something deeper and older, a vibration that came up through the stone and through her hands and into her, and she felt it in the marrow of her, in the part of her that had been reading her father's notes since she was 9, and following the frequency of something she couldn't name, crack sealed. Not fast, not dramatic. Steadily like the closing of an eye, the stone rejoining along the fault line, the color drawing back inside until there was just the column in the morning light, the color of old blood and deep water, coming at the frequency you felt before you heard it. The keeper made it sound again, the structured sound, the one with intent. Then it went down into the earth, the chord completed. 7 tones, a single sustained note that was also 7 notes, and then quiet. Reyes filed his report and didn't say much else. Senna filed a report that was twice as long and substantially more useful and got redacted in 6 places. Kale spent 4 days writing in his notebook and then submitted a paper to 3 journals simultaneously. Was considered poor form in academia, and it was the most widely read paper on Ankenu studies in the field's short history. Mara submitted nothing. She was 17. She wasn't sure what the protocol was. She was sitting outside the field station on the 6th day, watching the column when Kale came and sat beside her. He had 2 cups of something that was theoretically coffee, and he handed her one. They want to debrief you, he said. The hegemony and 2 universities. And someone from the Accord Liaison Office, who I'm told is usually very difficult to get a meeting with. I know, she said. I told them you needed a few more days. She looked at him. You can't do that, she said. They're not going to. I'm your father, he said. Told them you needed a few more days, they agreed. He paused. I was fairly insistent. She looked back at the column. It was quiet. The hum was still there, the back of the teeth frequency, but it was different now. Settled. Like a note that had found its octave. The stars are still counting, she said. He was quiet for a moment. You remember that? I kept the note. He was quiet for another moment then. I meant that the universe is ancient, and doing something we can barely perceive, and we're part of it, whether we understand it or not. It was, he stopped. I thought it was a comfort. I wasn't sure you'd know what it meant. I didn't, she said. I do now. She drank the coffee. It was bad. It was the same thermos, the same battered gray, and the coffee was as bad as it had always been. Feelings. And she thought about the Unkanu building their anchors and leaving the keeper to tend them across the centuries. And she thought about what it meant to stay. To decide that something mattered enough to keep count of it, to maintain the circuit even when no one was watching, to be the kind of presence that simply does not stop. She thought about witness, about what it costs to see something clearly and say, I see you, without looking away. I want to learn the rest of the language, she said, the Ankanu, all of it. The tertiary cipher is just the surface layer. There are at least 3 deeper registers, and I have a theory about the syntax that. I know, he said. He sounded like he did, actually. Like he'd read everything she'd written and then read the spaces between. I'll introduce you to Dr. Patton, the one who was wrong about. Versus faces. Boundary. You can be right in person, she almost smiled. I already am. The column hummed. Morning light hit it, and it was the color of deep water, and the color of old blood. And it was, she thought, genuinely beautiful. The way things are beautiful when you understand what they're for. She stayed there until the sun moved, so did he. It was enough.